Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwolere. Chelsea are the new Club World Cup champions. Gianni Infantino says the competition has marked a new era for club football. But has the Club World Cup really been a success? Today we have Adam Crafton in New York, and who was also at the Club World Cup final for us, as well as Phil Hay, lead writer for the Athletic FC newsletter. Now ahead of the final, speaking with broadcasters DAZN, FIFA President Gianni Infantino was full of praise, describing the tournament as a huge success at Trump Tower at a press conference. You were there ahead of the final for Adam. I mean, what do you make of all that?
The tournament or the press conference?
Talk about the press conference first, then we'll go into the tournament properly.
Well, the press conference was, so in case anyone missed it, FIFA have opened a new office in New York, and that is in Trump Tower, kind of just by Central Park, which made for a pretty bizarre experience because there's a little coffee shop on the floor above. So every time someone was making a coffee, it would kind of drown out whatever Gianni Infantino was attempting to say, which some might say is a blessing at certain moments during it. But it's interesting because Infantino these days, he doesn't really do press conferences. He didn't do one at the last two FIFA congresses. It means he's never really been asked about the decision to award 2030 World Cup to about 15 different countries and the 2034 World Cup to Saudi Arabia, and we were told only questions about the Club World Cup would be accepted during this event. And it wasn't really a press conference because what you had was Infantino stood on a stage, and then behind him, he had this kind of catalogue of FIFA legends. So you had Brazilian Ronaldo, Roberto Baggio, Alessandro Del Piero, Hristo Stoichkov, Esteban Cambiaso. There's another one who I've forgotten.
Kaká was there, wasn't he?
Kaká. That's because he doesn't say very much. So Kaká was there, and they lined up behind him. And then, as with all sorts of Infantino press engagements, there's not that many opportunities for the press. It tends to become a speech rather than a press conference. So the first 15 minutes or so was basically him just talking. And saying how fantastic it's been and how nobody said that the games would go ahead and they went ahead. No one said they'd get a broadcaster and they got a once-in-a-lifetime broadcast deal. No one said they'd sell tickets and all the stadiums are full. Not quite true. But so there was a lot of this stuff going on. And then when the questions started, and I think over a 45 or 50-minute event, they took about 7 or 8 questions. And every time Infantino made a point, he would then turn to one of his FIFA legends to back up his point. Well,
they're being paid to be there. I'm just curious. Can they be?
No, honestly, I was watching it thinking they must be, because why else would you almost debase yourself in that way, almost as like a little boy to Infantino, the man, and just sort of nod along. FIFA insists they aren't paid as an income, but they are there for pretty much the full tournament on FIFA dime, in 5-star hotels, in boxes, etc. But I mean, you wouldn't think players of that level and heritage would love a hotel room and some tickets and some hospitality that much that they would go to those lengths. But maybe they do. Maybe they do. Or maybe there's also, I think it's possible there's a kind of tiered system of ambassadors because they have thousands across the world. So I do wonder whether there's some sort of tiered system that has different incentives based on the levels of engagement.
All right. Well, Phil, let's talk about the football because it is still a football tournament despite all the noise around it. What have you made of the tournament?
I think Infantino is going to describe it as a huge success no matter what happened. He'd have said that if half the teams hadn't turned up.
Sorry, he actually described it as a huge success.
Huge.
Well, fair enough. Well, just to prove my point, yeah. I genuinely think that I would, there'd be less cynicism about the tournament if FIFA didn't keep trying to tell you that it's the greatest invention in the history of the sport. But I do often feel like Infantino is trying to convince himself rather than many of the people listening. I would imagine that those really close to him do take on the guise of nodding dogs. And, with them, he's preaching to the converted. But with the rest of us, he must know that there's a certain amount of eye rolling. I mean, there is part of me that does actually really like the concept of clubs from all over the world playing each other when ordinarily they wouldn't. Like Boca Juniors versus Bayern Munich, or, that sort of club playing European side like PSG, Real Madrid is actually the sort of fixture that I'm quite here for. But I just can't be doing with the manufactured hype, which is what we saw an awful lot of in the States, and which I assume we're going to see a lot of leading up to the World Cup in 2026 as well. I mean, the final last night, it has to be said that both teams seem to care about it. And I think that's probably because players just aren't programmed to enjoy losing games, or even to be that philosophical or blasé about losing games. They're competitive animals. And I think with a tournament like this, once you get beyond the question of, are we as a club going to bother with it and take it seriously, it's probably not that difficult to get players to buy into it. I mean, it's a trophy. And in the grand scheme, I suppose you would say it's not a wholly insignificant one. I've never really been sure exactly where it ranks, and I still can't decide. But there is definitely this appeal of being seen to have the full set of medals, the full set of trophies. And that's probably why PSG were so niggly last night. One good, solid, trademark performance in New Jersey, and they've put together the perfect season, or about as perfect a season as a club in France are ever going to have. And they are used to having their own things their own way. I spotted Nasser Al-Khelaifi just before half-time, caught on camera puffing out his cheeks with PSG 3-0 down. And they were being made to swallow a bit of their own medicine, which they clearly didn't like. But I mean, as far as the players go, don't forget that the bonuses at play here as well. So there is a vested interest for them. I was reading Adam's piece this morning, and it was saying in there that Chelsea put up something close to the kind of bonuses you'd expect, or the payments you'd expect if you were going for the Premier League or the Champions League. And realistically, so Chelsea would, because winning that last night, in total, the tournament's worth what? More than £80 million to them? Something like that. Why wouldn't you go after that money seriously? And I think that's probably where FIFA have had quite a big win with this.
Yeah, you think about the windfall to a certain degree, but also, Adam, let's think about the football. I mean, for Chelsea, considering this is a team that, some might say are still finding out who they are, beating PSG in a final like that, I mean, that's quite epic for their fans alone as well.
Yeah, it is. And look, I think from Chelsea's point of view, the value of winning it will not just be in the money they get today, but also kind of the branding value of it, to actually be able to go around for the next 4 years and tell sponsors we are the best club in the world, whether people mean that or not. If you're pitching that to a major global company that kind of knows about football but isn't necessarily completely across the nuances between Champions League, Premier League, Club World Cup, Conference League, all this sort of stuff, then that probably sounds pretty impressive to a chief marketing officer at a US company. So, sorry, I've gone immediately off what this means football-wise, back on to why it's also good for Chelsea from a football point of view. But I think from Chelsea's football perspective, I think it just builds that sense of, there's been a lot of questions about Chelsea's strategy for the last few years. I don't think this is like everything. It means that everything they've done is correct. There's clearly been some pretty peculiar moves and decisions over the past few years. But I think the consensus now is Chelsea have a collection of really young, talented players with a coach who can clearly motivate them, continuing to get better. I think everyone felt João Pedro would be a really good signing, and the early signs are that that's probably going to be the case. But there was also, I thought, the story of Trevor Chalobah, for example, yesterday. A player who had been, pushed out and loaned out, and now he's come back and got back in the team. Him and Colwill yesterday was superb for Chelsea. Cucurella as well. So there's quite a few stories in there of players who looked kind of down and out, who have fought their way back, and then other players like, Caicedo and Pedro and Neto that just look like really good signings, that looked like pretty good bets when they signed it, and are proving to be that.
Yeah, we have to talk about Donald Trump, and we have to talk about the halftime ceremony, or just the ceremony of the final anyway, around the final, I should say. Donald Trump making an appearance halftime, and let's not forget about the trophy ceremony at the end, Phil. I mean, what did you make of all that? I guess we're looking at football body meets politics, that kind of very strange mix, but also, when you think of what Adam's talking about in terms of, Trump Towers now being the headquarters of FIFA, I mean, I don't know how that sits with me personally, but how did that sit with you?
Yeah, there's a lot feeding into this, and the presence of Trump, and it's not just him. Elsewhere in the world, Infantino courts political influence and rubs shoulders with people high up, particularly in the Middle East, in Qatar and Saudi Arabia as well. That is a strand of what FIFA are doing. I think with this game and tournament specifically, they feel like they're chasing the Super Bowl commercial format, if that's fair to say. And I guess that ties into the way in which they've been chasing the American market full stop. First of all, with the Club World Cup, and then with the World Cup itself next year. I have to say, as I sat through the halftime show, I got the sense that I wasn't their target audience, if you catch my drift. A 44-year-old Scottish bloke. Adam's about 15 years younger than me, so he might have had a very different perspective on it. But from my point of view, it was pretty naff, and it was always going to be. And there is part of me that wonders that what an American who, say, is only vaguely into football or isn't into football at all but happened to stumble across it would have made of it. Would they have liked it? Would it have been appealing, or would the reaction have been, what is this? What's this all about? As for the trophy presentation, I'm not the only person who's pretty uncomfortable with Infantino's proximity to Donald Trump and others. And as I say, I'm not just saying that because it is Trump. And it was sort of coming to something over the weekend when you had Sepp Blatter coming out and basically accusing FIFA of selling its soul to Saudi Arabia. I think the geopolitical nature of all this does kind of grate on people. And I don't know, we had Salt Bae at the World Cup in 2022, didn't we, on the pitch? These people are going to be on the scene. They're going to be rounding about what's happening in the football itself. But I think supporters and spectators, they don't like to see these individuals making it all about them or being any more prominent than they should be. It does tend to grind their gears a little. But Infantino clearly wants Donald Trump to be front and centre to some extent, and you'd think that's going to be the case next summer as well. It just needs to be kept within sensible limits. But FIFA does seem to love largesse.
Yeah, I mean, it's all a matter of taste, isn't it, though, Adam? I mean, this is an American event ahead of the World Cup as well. They can put their spin on it if that's the way you want to look at it. But did Doja Cat do it for you? Did Thames do it for you? But also, let's not forget,
be honest.
Trump was there, but no UEFA president Alexander Ceferin.
Yeah, I suppose if we just kind of take some of that one by one, what Phil just said was interesting about the point about kind of the new fan and how this engages the new fan. I mean, I was there yesterday with my partner, his first ever soccer game, right? So as that case study, that was quite an interesting thing to sort of observe what he thought about it and different things like that. And I think on the halftime show, it was really. It seemed to me as though it was an event in the stadium. It felt like an event that was made for broadcast because it was on a really raised platform, and the artists were like this speck really in the distance. Whereas normally for a halftime show, you're using the pitch, and you're making full use of the venue. Now, I presume whether it was because of timings or because of the concerns over the quality of the pitch, which was being watered pretty much throughout the whole of the halftime show because it was so hot again yesterday at MetLife Stadium, that they were worried perhaps about damaging the pitch and then having a load of accusations about undermining the product. But the actual show itself, I thought was pretty good. I thought it was fine. I mean, it had kind of a mix of different artists from different backgrounds. People around me seemed to enjoy it. The sense was just like we can't see enough of it. But what you did get on broadcast was some of those incredible skyline shots because of this where the platform was. So I think there's kind of some logistical questions about it. As far as I know, it cost a fortune. That won't shock you. and it also took about 25 minutes for the game to restart. It wasn't a 15-minute half time. And I think on that point, I'm not like one of those people that's like, oh, but the laws of the game says it has to be every 50, it has to be 15 minutes long. But I think the teams and the players need clarity over, look, if it's going to be 25 minutes, not the end of the world, but you need to tell us, because with the way that sports science is now, there's probably all different things that they would want the players to be doing to avoid injuries, to be keeping warm, to all of that sort of stuff. And I think also broadcasters will want to know their timings as well, so that they can adequately plan, scheduling and all that kind of stuff. So those are a couple of kind of the things that come out of that. In terms of the Trump stuff, it was pretty incredible in the stadium, from the sense of just watching the reaction. So before the game, the jumbotron goes round, and it got Trump and Infantino on screen. It must have been half a second. This was before the national anthem was played, and some boos started. So as soon as the boos started, it very quickly moved on. But then it was the national anthem. And then when the United States flag came on screen, that was when really audible booing came. And bear in mind, this was a local audience, largely. It's not thousands of people travelling from France and England filling the stadium. These were American people booing the American president and the flag. I'm not sure whether the screen also showed whether that booing during the national anthem. I only saw one of the screens, so maybe a different screen was showing people. So that was pretty remarkable. And then the anthem ended, and then a section of fans started chanting USA, USA. So it was like there was different pockets within the stadium, clearly had different views. So at that point you're thinking, okay, well, it kind of shows what it is, a country that is divided and split. But then at the end of the game, when Trump walked back on with Todd Bowley and Infantino and Nasser Al-Khelaifi, the booing was there again, and everyone could hear it. And when he then posed for a photo, I think with the referees, that was the loudest booing. Now, whether Chelsea fans really disagreed with a Moises Caicedo yellow card in the first half, and that was the reason for the booing, who knows? Was it boos of adulation for Trump, perhaps? So it felt like a bit of a moment, but he just didn't seem bothered. I mean, that was the other bit. I mean, even as he's walking off the pitch, he's waving to people. He has this ability to find the people in the crowd who are smiling at him, and waves at them. And FIFA don't really seem to care either. I mean, the only people who seemed bothered were like Reece James and Cole Palmer, who were looking at him clearly thinking, is this fella going to move, or do we lift the trophy with him?
Infantino also boasted, Adam, about the revenue the competition had generated, quoting $33 million per match. Now, does revenue alone justify the expansion of such a competition? Because I really want to talk about player welfare right now.
Depends who you ask. The owners of the clubs involved, I think, are really happy. They're really happy. And it was really interesting, like the couple of years before this tournament, where you had the Premier League sort of criticising this tournament and saying, it shouldn't happen and all this sort of stuff. Well, the people who owned Chelsea and Manchester City definitely weren't saying that. And as far as I know, like Liverpool, Man United, Arsenal, Spurs, Newcastle, Villa, Forest, they'd all love to be in the next edition. But would they love to be in the next edition because they love the idea of the tournament? Or is it just because they know they might get over $100 million? In a time of, whether it's cost cutting at certain clubs or PSR demands at other clubs, where you're selling hotels and women's teams, that extra money is super useful. There is some balance, I think, with that money. You have to set it against, the clubs that did it this summer won't be able to do the money spinning pre-season tours. They can be anywhere between 15 to 30 million pounds. It's quite FIFA didn't have tax breaks, I don't think, for the teams competing in the tournament. So there's going to be some pretty heavy tax implications to that as well. And then also player bonuses. One of the teams in the tournament said to me, it's cheaper for us to lose in the to lose the final than win the final, because of the bonuses. There was only a $10 million difference, I think, only a $10 million difference if you won the final or lost the final. Obviously, there's kind of long-term brand value. In terms of does the revenue justify the tournament, I think players themselves are split. You have some players who are very, very concerned about the long-term demands on their bodies, the fact they never get a holiday, they never get a break, they just roll from competition to competition to competition, and they want, and the coaches as well, and they want these major organisations that barely seem to speak to each other, whether it's Premier League, UEFA, La Liga, FIFA, to just get in a room, redesign the calendar to make it healthier for them, so that they're not putting their bodies at risk, that they have a more healthy balance between their lifestyles. The only caveat I'd say to all of this is not that many football clubs now are making profits. And one of the biggest reasons for that, which players' unions do not like to recognise, is that the wages that players are paid as a proportion of club revenue is extremely high. If you add agent fees onto that as well, and it's just getting higher and higher and higher, which means the pressure on the clubs to find fresh revenue sources to unlock this growth is constant. And that's what leads them into supporting tournaments like this. And at some point, there will need to be a recognition from the players that they either do have to continue to play and play and play, or they may have to start to accept that, it's 300 grand a week instead of 325 grand a week. I don't think we're talking here about like union busting in the way that we would talk about it in kind of like the 80s and 90s. But I do think there has to be a recognition from the player side over the pressures the clubs are under to drive revenues. I don't know if you think that discussion will ever see the light of day, Phil.
I think it will, but I think there will be massive resistance to the idea that it has to involve less earning potential than they have at the moment. You might remember Bielsa saying this when he was at Leeds, actually, that the calendar was too congested and that it needs to be cut. But if it's going to be cut, we all need to accept that we're going to make less money. And this was a coach who, no getting away from it, was earning £3 million a year with Leeds in the Championship. That was big money for him that he was being paid. But that was his argument, but it was kind of caveated by him with the hint of, but nobody's going to do that, are they? I think this tournament has definitely shown an appetite for the money on offer. And do you know what? I think for all the hammer that the Club World Cup has taken, and quite a lot of it deservedly, FIFA have been pretty savvy in the way that they've structured this financially, because they've created a tournament which, from a financial point of view, there's no particularly good argument for boycotting or avoiding. If we got to a point further down the line where there was a serious discussion about what you're going to cut from the calendar or what you're going to get rid of to ease the pressure on players and their physical well-being, then the players themselves would probably say, well, it'd be good to keep the Club World Cup because actually there's a lot of money for us in that. If we're in it and we're competing and we're doing well and we're getting bonuses, then we benefit in a big way. And I think from an English perspective, that's probably where something like the League Cup comes under threat, because there's just nothing like the same revenue generated by that, not even close. Chelsea go home with what, like close to £100 million for 4 weeks' worth on the basis of a Champions League they won a long time ago. And you're not telling me that other clubs in the Premier League, like Adam was saying, won't be seriously envious of that. Like, this is the profit and sustainability era, and I know PSR is about to change in its format, but it still will remain in some form. And a bonus injection of £80 million, whatever it is, after deductions go on, there'll be stuff to be taken off it, but it's still a massive advantage. And nobody at Chelsea will be thinking that this hasn't been worth their time, or worth their while having a proper go at. And so what happens now, if FIFA can produce similar or comparative prize pot for 4 years' time, clubs across the world are going to want a piece of it. They absolutely are. And that doesn't mean they think the scheduling makes sense. It doesn't think they mean that they think that the players' bodies can really cope with another tournament. But, FIFA's kind of relying on that old phrase, if you can't beat them, join them. And I think that's how it'll be.
Yeah, I think sometimes we even focus on the big end of the scale, Adam. Those teams like, the PSGs or the Manchester Cities or the Chelseas. But, I was reading something yesterday. Auckland FC made 676% of their annual revenue from playing in this tournament. They're not one of the more glamorous teams, but that's 3.2 or 3 point something million dollars they never had before.
Yeah, and actually the way that their money was distributed was quite interesting, because they actually had to. I think FIFA were paying for a lot of things when clubs were here, but stuff like travel, for example, clubs had to pay themselves. So actually, if you're only getting three million or so, by the time you've flown over, kind of your 70-person party, back and forth, and all the different flights and all that sort of stuff, then that does eat into it. And also, what happened was the federation in New Zealand, because Auckland are kind of this semi-professional outfit, basically said, look, you guys don't have a need to receive millions in this way. So actually what happened was the federation, I think, have taken some of the money and redistributed it in a more even way amongst to grow the sport in their nation. Now, I mean, could you imagine if the English FA said to Chelsea, we're going to take a proportion of yours and redistribute it to grow the game? I mean, it's actually what should happen, by the way. It would be, a much healthier use of, growing the sport. When FIFA are saying, 2 billion revenue and all of it's gone back into club football, that's true. But, the vast majority has been concentrated in about, in the 7 or 8 richest clubs. The teams that reached the final both will have left with over $100 million. So that's 200 million gone straight away. The losing semi-finalists and quarter-finalists are probably looking at 60, 70 million each. So you're talking there immediately about 600, 700 million of this has just gone to clubs that didn't need a bigger gap, right? Like the French league does not need PSG to have another 100 million. They already can't compete. And there's not that many leagues in the world actually that can absorb one team getting a windfall like that. It's only really the Premier League, because everyone has so much money in the Premier League. So if Chelsea come out, I don't know, post-tax, probably 60, 70 million, for them, it's a player, right? Like the way that they spend, it's João Pedro. Okay, so it could have a big difference, but it's not going to distort the Premier League. But like Fluminense going back to Brazil with semi-final money, 4 Brazilian teams being in this competition as well. You look at the last 4 or 5 winners of the Copa Libertadores have been all Brazilian teams, and they've had a few all Brazilian finals. There's a real danger, therefore, that this tournament over time actually just means that the Copa Libertadores is always going to be won by Brazilian teams. That's not good for the continent. So there's a lot of kind of distortive factors that are coming into this with the way that the money is being distributed, that FIFA don't really seem to want to appreciate or recognise. And I don't think we'll see the long-term... We may not notice this until 5 or 6 years down the track, where we're like, oh, that team that was in the Club World Cup semi-final was basically set up for the next 3 or 4 years. And I do think that's going to be a problem, even if some of the intention is good.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on, because we'll also discuss the role of the host as well as the attendances of the tournament as well. All right, Adam, throughout the tournament, even before it, you've written about this, and I've been keeping an eye on your X account about ticket prices and also at the attendance levels as well. Now, from the outside looking in, you'd think that all these stadiums were full of people and it was super well attended. But what have you noticed from where you've been sitting about the attendances and also how the tickets have been sold for this Club World Cup?
Yeah, I think the attendances went pretty much as I thought they would, in the sense of, there are some teams who are so big in America. Like the size of Real Madrid in America is staggering. Their games in the group stages, they played Salzburg, Al Hilal and Pachuca. So they've not got in there any, they weren't playing a team with like, really huge local support like Boca Juniors. They weren't playing the big European teams. They were the only team in the group stages that were consistently getting over 60,000. and that continued for them. Every city they went to, it was they would 80% of the stadium would be Real Madrid. I think other teams, found it more difficult, and other matchups found it more difficult. So the famous one was Mamelodi against was it Ulsan in Orlando, that got about 3,000 people in the stadium as the official attendance. I mean, those there seem to think it was even lower. But some of the Chelsea games, Chelsea against Benfica and Charlotte for the round of 16 had about 25,000. When you see it on broadcast in these giant NFL venues, it looks bad, right? Because I think at least European audiences, our kind of eyes are trained that if we see loads of empty seats, it means something's not that good. That's just the instinct I have when I see that. However, I would say a lot of these, Palmeiras against Al Ahly, right? Brazilian team against Egyptian team, on paper, before the tournament, how many people are looking at that and thinking it's going to get 47,000 people? I don't think they are. And they did. They got that at MetLife Stadium in New York. And I think one of the things that a lot of people didn't realise before the tournament, and FIFA themselves, by the way, is you have within the United States these incredible diasporas. So what that means is you almost have communities that will turn out in so many different areas of the country. And it meant you had these incredible attendances from areas like Philadelphia and New York for the Brazilian teams. You had, as we saw, Miami, Argentina for Boca Juniors. I felt really sorry for River Plate, who could have been one of the stories of the tournament from a fan's point of view, but they were out in Seattle where the Argentine contingent is nowhere near as big. You saw the Tunisian fans, the Egyptian fans, and that was all people within this country. The amount of people that travelled. I mean, Infantino promised before the tournament in the White House millions and millions of visitors. That did not happen. The people that were here were diaspora, immigrant communities. I mean, that's kind of the whole irony, right, of the cozying up at the moment to the White House, because the success of the soccer economy in the United States is still so tied to Hispanic communities and second generation, third generation immigrants within the United States. And that's
that ties into the USMNT, doesn't it? The Gold Cup final against Mexico. You interviewed Tyler Adams, where he was saying, I said to the players beforehand, you might as well get ready for this being like an away fixture, because we ain't going to have the majority of support in here. And that wasn't even just the case for the final. It was much the same for the semi-final against Guatemala. So Pochettino found himself talking after that game about how do we find American fans who want to come to the games, not necessarily more who are interested. There might be plenty out there who are interested, but how do we stop, home USMNT fixtures in the States basically feeling like away matches?
Yeah, and I think FIFA thought before the tournament, and this is like, Infantino did this fireside chat at a conference in the middle of the tournament. A fireside chat is one of those chats where you don't get to ask questions. It's when someone gets to talk. And
was it a fire? Was it an actual fire?
No fire. There's never a fire at a fireside chat. And he said at that point, football, soccer can be the number one sport in America. And he kind of goes on about this. And he's kind of obsessed with converting the kind of the vision of the white NFL fan into being a soccer fanatic. And the reality is, as I just said, it is these diaspora communities. They have a huge soccer support already within the United States if you bring the right games to them. And just on that whole thing of like number one sport in America, they're never going to be the number one sport in America, right? NFL is so big. That I think something like 96 of the 100 top broadcasts last year were NFL games. Not just, we're not just talking Super Bowl here. So there you're talking about like tens and tens of millions of people. A big soccer game in the United States gets a couple of million. You're talking about 25 times multiples in some cases. So, but what you should be able to say is, this is a country of over 350 million people. If we take a decent chunk of that, and make them really loyal and committed and repeat spenders, then that's fantastic. Then that is success. But as ever with him, it's biggest, it's best, it's spectacular, it's unrivaled, it's all this, to be frank, bullshit.
What do you think? I mean, Adam's probably laid it out quite nicely, actually, but what do you think FIFA's learnings will be from this tournament? Because obviously the World Cup is imminent.
I'm not sure they've necessarily learned anything about the weather, have they? I mean, like parts of the US, it gets very, very hot in the summer and has done for ever. It's not a revelation, and there isn't anything that FIFA can do about the climate specifically. It is caught in a bit of a quandary with this because it's going to be a Summer World Cup that's set in stone now and far too late to make any changes, and we've never considered, as far as I'm aware, that it wouldn't take place at this time of year. But if it is, and actually I saw some people discussing this on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it, about the possibility of abandoning certain European-friendly kickoff times to let the teams play later in the day when the heat isn't so severe or so bad or so punishing, and working it that way to a bit more care towards their well-being. But in order to do that, that would pose a risk to FIFA's TV audience, and I just don't see them going down that route. I don't see them wanting to do that. Aside from anything else, they have a huge number of games to cram in next summer because the World Cup, like the Club World Cup, is an expanded tournament, and they've only got a certain amount of time to cater for that through June and July. I actually felt like a bigger issue at the Club World Cup were the delays caused by the threat of thunderstorms. The in-match breaks where, we saw on quite a few occasions kind of genuine interludes in the middle of a fixture. And that completely changes the nature of the game, changes the integrity of the game. You just can't have a scenario in a serious and major competition where fixtures are routinely held up because it looks like there's going to be thunder and lightning. And again, I don't really see any solution to that. The weather just is the weather. So I think that the main focus for FIFA, as far as that's concerned, over the next 12 months is going to be how it's managed and what can be done to protect the players in particular, but not just them, also supporters in the various stadiums, making sure that there are enough provisions, enough water and everything else. Cooling breaks for the players, which have been going on at the Club World Cup. Although you have to say that beyond that, it's difficult to know what strategies you would have for kind of tackling what is pretty severe heatwave over in the States at the moment.
Sorry, just one other thing, Phil. I think I'm really interested to see what lessons FIFA have learned about how they price games for next year. It was one of the big stories in many ways of this tournament was just they do this dynamic pricing model, they say, in accordance with the way that things are done in America, which is kind of true. But I think it was pretty embarrassing at certain points on both ends of the scale. Both the way that they set out at the start to essentially extort from fans. Some of the prices that were being asked, right at the start after the draw for games in this tournament were pretty extortionate. The opening game, Inter Miami against Al Ahly, I think they're asking for about $350 for the cheapest seat in the stadium. To people who in Miami get to watch Messi every week anyway. It was pretty bizarre as a pricing strategy. And then you saw these extreme and pretty absurd fluctuations. So before the semi-final, I think it was Chelsea-Fluminense, you had semi-final tickets for that scheduled game going for about $470 on the Wednesday, and then by the Saturday it was $13. So it wasn't impossible. You had two people sat next to each other who would spend basically for the same seat $473 and $13, and that is not fair, basically. And it's weird, and I'm not sure they can do it in quite the same way. What I would say is, where they eventually listened, whether it was either out of embarrassment because they were worried about stadiums just not being full, they did reduce the prices massively in the end in order to get people in. But imagine if they'd set out at the start and said, all these other sports in America, NBA, NFL, they're ripping you off. We're going to be the sport. We know we have this big World Cup here next summer. We want you to get a taste of it. We want to bring in these new fans. We want you to experience this. We're going to set prices, therefore, at a really fair point. Somewhere like $50, $60, right? Which in the States, for best of the best sport, is pretty fair. But they just didn't go about it like that. And I think it turned people off at the start. And it was only when the prices fell that the stadium starts to fill up. But next year, I do suspect they will take the view, it's a World Cup, it's the most premium sports competition in the world, and we will set prices accordingly and try and get the most we can, because we then want to return that money to football all around the world.
Okay, brilliant. All right, Adam, Phil, thanks for your time and also your insights, and also thank you guys for watching as well. Don't forget to like the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave us a comment as well. That's it for now. We'll catch you next time. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.